Okay, so this is our final session together. Unless you come next to next week's lectures on Marx and Freud, strangely related to this session, I think. Again, I'm just curious to see how many of you have found the time to read Three-Body Problem. Okay. And as you know, it's the first part of the trilogy. Did you say you'd read?
I read the first, I started the second.
So, I mean, if you get interested in it, it's definitely worth reading all 3 volumes. As that's the whole of the story. And this is a different kind of author, in that, certainly unlike Cormac McCarthy, who's not really a science fiction author at all, or unlike Frank Herbert, who, as we saw, was on the soft side of science fiction. Cixin Liu is a hard-core science fiction writer. I say that because science fiction is often divided in many ways. We talked earlier about science fantasy and science fiction, but within science fiction there's kind of, on the one hand, what's called hard SF, which is scientific, and people like Larry Niven and others make sure that everything they say is correct according to what is known as science. And Liu is definitely on that side. He works, he said he's a heating engineer. I thought he was in computing, he may have changed jobs, but he's like a professional scientist, technician.
There's a short story in the New Scientist Christmas edition, so if it's still on sale, I think, at exclusive books, you'll see a really interesting short story by him.
Yeah, about politics and the internet, from what I've been told. It sounds, I wish I'd known it was there. Because that's a part of what I wanted to talk about today. And it follows on a little bit from yesterday's lecture. If you remember, yesterday I said that there were kind of 2 sides to McCarthy. There was one side which was quite Hobbesian in his conscious beliefs and ideas, but yet somehow at the same time there was, I mean, obviously you could call it many different things, but for these lectures I'll call it the Adam Smith, the Smithian dimension, the dimension of what Smith calls moral sentiments, but which you find today in psychoanalysis and psychology, and so on, an emphasis on the deep sociability of human beings. And we saw, I think, in McCarthy that he's not all Hobbesian. There is a very strong Smithian element, and I think you asked, was that deliberate juxtaposition? And my feeling was that maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was an unconscious thing that comes through, not a planned thing, and that's one of the things about writing, just to speak generally, that often the most interesting writing is where things happen without the author quite knowing why. And you remember that McCarthy himself belongs to that school, and he said, well, I don't really want to go and talk about my books. People should just read them. What there is what's there. I don't quite know what's there, in a sense. And I found that very interesting, as that's a very close parallel to the, what should we call him, formerly South African author, J.M. Coetzee, who's also very resistant to assigning meanings to his work or saying what he thinks it's about. His job is to write it, not to interpret it. So that means that it's open to interpretation. Now, I'm sure that happens on every level. I'm an addict of reading thrillers as well as philosophy and things like that. So I'm pretty sure that Clive Cussler doesn't have like a lot of deep secret meanings at work in his many novels, although if I could put my ingenuity to work and probably find something. But he's not that kind of writer. The interest in him is not in the texture of his writing and the depths it has and so on. It's in plot-driven kind of straightforward writing. With McCarthy, it's very different. His prose style, you can see it immediately has depth, and he does slightly disjunctive things with it, like he won't allow what James Joyce called perverted commas, inverted commas to show where speech occurs and so on. Somehow he thinks that just clutters up the page and robs people of the concentration they should be giving to the novel. Jose Saramago is also well known for doing that, for refusing to assign speech in a very straightforward way, because somehow these three, and doubtless others, see that as robbing the reader of the experience of grappling with the text in some ways. So, I think some of the defining marks of what I've been calling canonical literature is that it has depth, that it can be reread, that it poses some problems, and there's more going on than just on the surface. Although a part of me thinks that even superficial works have interest and things like that. So I thought it would be interesting to begin to talk about this novel, or really the series of novels, although we don't have time to really talk about them all, in a similar perspective, really, because one thing I found quite interesting in doing a little bit more reading around the topic which these lectures enable me to do, is Cixin Liu's own movement and ambivalence about the literary and about the place of science fiction and what it does. With his career as a technician, as a scientist, he's not really all that interested in literature. He's a hard science fiction writer, as I think you can see. And I've just assembled a bit of material. He's written several pieces and interviews about his work and so on. And one of these is tellingly called Beyond Narcissism, What Science Fiction Can Offer Literature. And you can see immediately in the title that he's just not that happy with literature, which he sees as narcissistic. And he speaks in some ways like many of my friends in the Academy of Science, of which I'm somewhat strangely a member, who don't get literature. They don't really, some do, but some don't. And they say, well, I don't see why do you read novels? Why don't you just read factual books? And don't tell me you read poetry, do you? There's, in some of them, a real C.P. Snow sort of two cultures hostility to the literary. And as a hard science fiction writer, Liu talks about how when he began writing, he was definitely in this technological hard science kind of mode. And this is expressed here. He says, well, he doesn't really like modern literature. Arguably, he says, literature is moving towards an ever deeper form of narcissism, is what he means. And the grand narrative is disappearing and being replaced by ever more introspective and ever more internalized accounts. This development has naturally caused the relationship of humanity with nature to fade from view. But in some cases, it has gone so far as to grow impatient, even with interhuman interactions, leaving only the mumbled monologue of the intrapersonal relationship. And even as it abandons period and popular literature, such literature complains that it in turn is being rejected by them. So he's thinking, I imagine, of a whole range of writers here, from someone like Henry James, writing in the 19th century, who is perhaps one of the first writers to articulate in his essays on the art of fiction, the prefaces to his own novels, he articulates the great break in the novel from realism to modernism. And he finds that he actually doesn't like very much the very successful competitive author Charles Dickens, who's very popular. Great at plots, very energetic language, but he says there's no people, really. There's no sexuality in Dickens. They're weird, they're not interested in being human in the way that James begins to develop a style of writing that is interested in the intricacies of interpersonal relationships, which Liu here is rejecting. He wouldn't like Henry James, he wouldn't like Marcel Proust, he wouldn't like James Joyce, he wouldn't like lots of people. I mean, he doesn't name any particular people there, but the sort of things he's thinking of, you could see as being Jane Austen, Henry James, Virginia Woolf, some postmodernist writing, all kinds of things, who he feels as a scientist, they're not looking at the big picture. They're not interested in the big picture. He sees that as a terrible loss, and that's why he turned to science fiction. And he says, well, look at it historically. Actually, most literature has really been about the relationship between humans and the natural world, not about the relationship between individuals. You know, that's how he understands things. In the midst of ancient cultures, gods took the form of natural phenomena. Their stories focused on understanding the natural world. So he sees Homer, the Odyssey and the Iliad, as actually not being about people, but about the relationship to gods, and through that to the natural world and so on. Literature did not become the study of people and their systems until after the Renaissance. For this reason, conventional literature has always given me the impression of being very narcissistic. So, as I say, he's got a really two cultures kind of anti-literary bent at this stage, at least. For him, it's just too indulgent. You've got to be connected to the real world. The real world is the world of nature. Understanding nature is done via science. It is sometimes just a distraction for him. And the genre that's working hardest to get past this narcissism, he says, is science fiction. So he sees himself as a champion of a science fiction which is going to rescue literature from itself, from its navel gazing and just focus on irrelevant human beings kind of thing. And for him, the basic element of science fiction seems to be humanity's relationship to nature. And as such, it's capable of giving literature an opportunity to once more broaden its boundaries. And hence, it's no surprise to us, although it was a surprise to me when I first read this book in the context of putting a course together which preceded this, that in The Three-Body Problem itself, he turns to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring at the start of the novel, because that's what he sees as being really, really important. So that's the first thing, or one point to underline, is so the book is in this course because this author forcefully articulates that he sees what literature should be interested in but often isn't, but which science fiction can be interested in and should be, and his science fiction does that. It's in these kind of large-scale, system-like enquiries of the relations between humanity and nature. And as you read the book, you'll see not only is the first and second section refers directly to Silent Spring, but there's an environmentalist, involved in the plot, whose task is, paradoxically enough, to promote environmentalism and, in terms of the plot, to do this to discredit science. But there's an appreciation, especially in the opening chapters or several of the chapters, of the natural world and what's happening to it. So the book, one dimension of the book, one theme of the book, or whatever you want to call it, is definitely concerned with the relations between humans and nature, which he sees as being something science fiction can and should do, and which his own early science fiction was particularly interested in. Because he's been writing through most of his life, although it's only The Three-Body Problem which really gained significant attention from the literary people that he didn't really like anyway, and gained international recognition and translation and publication. In the way that I've mentioned again and again, for a book to survive, it has to be interesting. Most books, like my own Academic Freedom in a Democratic South Africa on sale outside, just disappear from view very quickly. 99.9% of books are unheard of, apart from people like me whose job is to actually read them and see if there's anything interesting in them somewhere. So, in this account, Cixin says that, well, that's how he started, with a dislike of literature and its interest in people, and a feeling that science fiction could rescue literature from its pointless navel-gazing and get into the real problems and real science and things like that. But then, as he's writing the trilogy, he begins to change in and through the writing. And that's something I've also tried to suggest to you, that writing is something which changes the author as much as expresses the author, or expresses the author's intentions and so on. A writer who's deeply involved with their writing finds it doesn't simply transcribe what they think. It is what they think, but their thinking changes in and through the writing. And as I say, with my revered hobby, Clive Cussler, that's not what's happening in the writing. You know, there's not any profound personal change, I don't think, taking place. That's the kind of and yet curative, that's what we tend to understand writing as. You do a plan, you do a plot, then you write it, and it's all over and done with. But real writing, with joined up letters, as it were, you know, is more of a process that involves the writer in change as well as potentially the reader. So what did he find as he's continuing as a writer? He starts off from this hard SF position, actually just writing about technology and various problems and so on. But when he starts this new series, something else begins to happen. The world in the Santee series, that's the three-body problem series, comes from a difficult problem in celestial mechanics, and that is the three-body problem. So that was its starting point. He thought, yeah, that's like a really interesting thing, let me write about that. This led me to create a planet and a race that exists only in the imagination. As he's not interested in the human, remember, so he's saying, well, what would a creature have to be like to exist on a world which had three suns and underwent periodic massive transformations and forms of destruction, tri-solaris as it is. From this foundation emerged this civilization's way of life, technological characteristics, and internal motivation for wanting to expand across the galaxy and conquer all whom they encountered, which is the plot of the series. Living in a constant state of life or death crisis, the three-body people are clearly distinguishable from the people of Earth. They have no time for or interest in art and literature. At the same time, they do not understand lies or tricks. So in other words, in terms which we were discussing yesterday, they're quite like that extreme end of an idea of language in which language only nominates or refers, isn't infused within imagination, is incapable of double meanings, and isn't capable of lying. And you can also see, having looked at the previous slides, that the tri-solarians are a bit like him. You know, he's not really interested in art and literature and these personal exchanges. But then as he's writing that, what he found, as he puts it, was my moral concepts and my value system began to waver, which was really weird. It was a very peculiar experience to me. At this point, my science fiction writing has entered its third stage, and I'll discuss this in a minute. I call this my social experimentation stage. In it, I'm focusing my efforts on depicting the effects of extreme situations on human behavior and social systems. So, despite his considerable resistance to being engaged with the human, he finds as his writing career progresses that he's drawn into the human. And then, you know, it's not going to surprise you, I don't think, that when that happens, as it does in the trilogy, what happens is this comes from his own experience. And there may be ways in which, this is what I venture in a longer interpretation, in which the initial commitment to a scientific anti-humanism is clearly rooted in some traumatic childhood experience. And for that reason, it's not surprising that the first book of the trilogy is like a real surprise for a science fiction writer, a science fiction reader. Say you've been reading Cixin Liu for 10 years, great, there's a new one in the bookstore, let me go and get it. So you go and get it. And the first chapter is not set in some far off, distant future, or planet, or whatever. It's set in the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So that's like really surprising. Remember, we've talked about this before. Science fiction as a genre has quite strong constraints, strong enough for Dune to be refused by 23 publishers. Imagine the publisher reading the first chapter of The Three-Body Problem. They say, this isn't you, Liu. Why are you doing this? And of course, it's so interesting to hear about the IT stuff. One way of understanding this is the ways in which 4 writers who are articulating experience and so on, imagining and so on, kind of inescapably, they are writing from within their society as well. And let me just show you a little bit of what I mean. Well, sorry, this is just the say, just to give you a more condensed version. This is the position he moves away from. From the time I first began to change from a science fiction fan and science fiction author, the most dominant peculiarity of my creative impetus was I was not interested in human society, only in the science fiction genre's strange beauty and power. For an author in the realm of traditional literature, such thoughts would be inconceivable or even heretical, but that is how my creative journey began. The first part of my career I call my pure science fiction stage. But that's what as he ages and grows and so on, that's what he moves away from. Let me say this. And in the postscript to this edition of the book, there are some words from the author which are a little bit different to the stance from the essay that I was quoting from earlier. And he remembers, and this is his love of science, he remembers in the 60s seeing the first Chinese satellite in the sky, proud, being excited. My heart was filled with indescribable curiosity and yearning, and etched in my memory just as deeply as these feelings was the sensation of hunger. Hunger was the constant companion of every child, because he was growing up in and through the Cultural Revolution in China, which led to, and I've forgotten the figure, but a massive number of deaths from starvation, as well as massive repression of the population and so on. So when he's talking about hunger, he literally means hunger. And can't you see how the looking up to the sky and the curiosity and the yearning that it gives him, that deep interest, what becomes a deep interest in science, is literally rooted in his historical experience as a hungry child, as a kind of distraction almost from that. That would be my hypothesis. I mean, this is such an interesting piece of writing, so I think it's more revealing than he knows it is, kind of thing. My parents weren't with me in this village because they were working at a coal mine more than 6,000 kilometres away. Now, he doesn't go into why they were doing that, and I haven't discovered that in the little research I've done, but I suspect that they may have been city intellectuals who were thrust out to work in the countryside. This mine that they were working in had been a combat zone for the factional civil wars of the Cultural Revolution. I remembered gunshots in the middle of the night, trucks passing in the street, filled with men clutching guns and wearing red armbands. So these are his childhood memories. And the point of him telling you is for him to explain why he likes science so much. But as he's saying that, the prose itself is revealing a set of deeply traumatic and painful memories, which, once you can see they're there, really enlightens your reading of the three-body problem. Because indeed, as I mentioned, it's such a surprise to see this novel begin with the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So what was happening there? Previously, also, we talked about how he loved nature and how a part of that was this scientific love of nature. He sees literature as being about humans and nature, and he's not interested in subjective experiences and so on. And this again is the context for that utterance. And this is what my discipline really enjoins on me, I think, is that when you look at expressions or utterances, obviously you hear what they're saying, but your stance towards what they're saying is one brilliantly put by my old mentor, Fred Jameson, who I mentioned before. Everything always means something else. Everything always means something else. Now, Clive Cussler I'm not so sure about, but Henry James, Marcel Proust, and, real textuality, complex textuality, which makes books rereadable and makes them live and last and be translated and stuff. It's interesting because you just feel there's something more going on than what's on the surface of what is being said. And it that's how it hooks you. In my discipline, you're trained to try and see those hooks and how they work and what's going on and so on. But if you're not trained in that discipline, you still feel them, but it's not your professional job or whatever to try and work out what they are or how they're working or what they're doing. That's what specifies my particular sorts of discipline. So when somebody says, look, I love science fiction, I don't like humanity, I love science fiction, I'm really interested in the relations between the big picture kind of humans and nature relations. I'm not interested in the minutiae of individual life. You go, okay, so that's what you're saying, but like that patient who comes into Freud's office and says, look, I'm going to tell you this dream, but before we go any further, you have to promise that you won't make it seem to be about my mother. Well, says Freud, you know immediately that it is going to be about the mother. Or as Shakespeare put it in a famous phrase, methinks the lady doth protest too much. So often when you assert something, especially in a loud voice, that brooks no contradiction, because you're not really sure of what you're saying. So, what is in that humanity and nature thing? Well, again, this little piece, I think, is so revealing or prompts interpretation or thought or whatever. As he just said, in that same year when I was first awed by the concept of a light year. See what I mean? This is on the surface. This is him. This is what he's interested in. He's interested in science, and he really is, and he knows his stuff. And he likes all these things. He's intensely interested in these things. But at the same time, and as a literary critic, again I'd say, at the same time, whoever made that up, what an incredible invention of the human mind a phrase like that is. Because it means that things have density. That at the same time as you say, I'm only interested in science, at the same time, you're not saying that. So that's the structure, that this has, which calls for you to interpret it. Just as if you're talking to somebody and they say, well, look, I don't want to give you a sense that, and then you know that there's something happening there, At the same year when I was first awed by the concept of a light year. So that's the statement. I am a scientist, I am powered by my interest in science, but at the same time there's something else going on. A flood, known as the Great Flood of August 75, occurred near my home village. And even here, you can see what use science is in this prose. I mean, again, forgive me for being a literary critic, but this is the sort of thing you've probably seen brackets in a sentence before, where something is bracketed off. And that is such a fascinating thing, because it's a bit like at the same time. It means that something is put forward for your attention, but removed from your attention at the same time. And here I think what you can see in those brackets are what I'd suggest is this child's dismay and distress, transmuted into knowledge. And as he kind of recollects this traumatic moment, the brackets are there to help him, because this is known as the Great Flood of August 75. It's classified, it's stacked away, it kind of halts the actual memories of that moment by packaging them in a particular name, knowledge, item of scientific understanding. Occurred near my home village. In a single day, 100.5 centimetres of rain fell, 58 dams of various sizes collapsed, and 240,000 people died in a resulting deluge. I thought I was looking at the end of the world. So, again, what I suggest there is you have a complicating of what Cixin Liu's interests and motivations are. So on the one hand, he's a hardcore technological, scientific SF writer and proud of that fact. But at the same time, and maybe in a bracket, there's some real experience there which is something is being done with it. And the terror, I thought I was looking at the end of the world. That's what is allowed to emerge, if you like, in the Three Bodies trilogy, which really goes into that. And okay, so that's one thing. So in other words, I'm suggesting that powering the writing and actually powering this deep interest in science is the human side, and some experience, traumatic experience, which, like traumatic experience, you don't really want it to occupy your mind the whole time. But if you can't find a way of dealing with it, again, as Freud put it, they have a choice: remembering, repeating, or working through. If you don't remember, you just repeat. You have to work it through. It's the only way to deal with it. So that's one dimension, I suggest. And that dimension then feeds into another dimension, which is, I found really interesting in these statements. And remember, the principle I'm alerting you to here is that everything always means something else. And a strong assertion of something can be covering over something else. So in the same full preface posters, I do not use my science fiction as a disguised way to criticize the reality of the present. You see, so my first question would be, why are you telling me that? Because why do you think I would think that? Unless you thought that. I'm not asking you, do you use your science fiction to criticize the present? You're saying that's what you think, except you're saying at the same time you do not think that. And I think we're at two dimensions to that. You know, one is Cixin Liu is writing from China, which is perhaps the most censored and repressive state on earth, or certainly one of them. So, actually reading the trilogy, I'm amazed he was allowed to publish them, actually. As if you could get into the second volume, particularly in the second volume, there's an intense critique of the groupthink of contemporary, whatever you're going to call it, communist, post-communist China. An intense critique and an interest in these outlawed forms of human rights interests, which I'm just amazed he's not in prison or banned or whatever. And with the short story, even more so. I do not use my science fiction in a disguised way to criticise the reality of the present. And then again, see, when somebody makes assertions like these, you know, one thing you can almost always be sure of is that there's a but going to come next. And indeed, there is a but. You know, the but, again, what an incredible human creation the word but is. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing for the mind to do, isn't it? To be saying something and then to say but, which kind of destroys everything you just said. You know, again, this is going back to McCarthy, not that he's talked about it, but I'm sure he'd agree, is this is one of the things he means by grammar. When he says language isn't only nomination, it's somehow syntactical and narrational, because but means you can be complex or contradictory. But I cannot escape and leave behind reality, just like I cannot leave behind my shadow. You know, which is quite a literary sentence, actually, you know, quite a nice turned literary sentence. Reality brands each of us with its indelible mark. And, you know, that kind of sentence, reality brands each of us with its indelible mark, that's